I am Matthew Jenkins Yarashevitz, Music Director Designate of the Canton Symphony Orchestra.
And I'm Rachel Hagemeyer, President and CEO.
This is Orchestrating Change. We are thrilled to be joined today in person by Chris Jenkins, Associate Dean for Academic Support, Liaison to the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and Visiting Professor of Musicology at Oberlin Conservatory. Concurrently with his work at Oberlin, he is also pursuing a Doctor of Musical Arts degree in Viola Performance from the Cleveland Institute of Music and a Ph.D. in Musicology from Case Western Reserve University. All of this on top of the degrees he already holds from Harvard University, New England Conservatory, Manhattan School of Music, and Columbia University. He is the former deputy director of the Barenboim-Said Foundation in the West Bank and was a third-place winner in the senior division of the 2005 Sphinx Competition. On top of all of this, he published his first book last year titled Assimilation versus Integration in Music Education. Chris Jenkins, this is quite a list of accomplishments you have, and we are absolutely delighted to be here with you today. Welcome to Orchestrating Change.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
I heard about you and your book. I think last summer we connected and then your book came out and we finally were able to make this happen. So very excited. I would love to just know about you and how you started your life as a young person and how music kind of came into your being, and just a little bit more about the background that maybe precedes Harvard and all that good stuff.
Yeah. So I think I'm probably what most conservatories would view as their ideal quote unquote minority candidate. My parents were professors. They were not musicians, but they listened to music all the time. WQXR in New York City, always on, still on, always when I come home and get to see them. So, my parents knew classical music. I listened to it growing up, started violin when I was 7 at the community music school down the street from me. Then went to more intensive programs, went to a prep program at Mannes School of Music, those kinds of things. Went to summer music camp, all the kinds of preparation that somebody on a string instrument typically, if not needs, will definitely benefit from once you get into a conservatory environment. And so I think, for me, that background was probably an important part of how I actually was offered my position at Oberlin that I have now.
But you didn't, of course, go to a conservatory for undergrad. How did you end up at Harvard?
I didn't, yeah. Well, I visited a number of schools, and I just had such a good time there. I mean, the people that I met were really, I think, on the kinds of people that I knew from school that I wanted to be around. Not everyone, that's for sure, but many people. And once I got there, I was very lucky, I think, to be absorbed into a very middle-class group of friends, which is not perhaps the most common denominator there. Looking back on it, I certainly knew folks there who were so exceedingly well-resourced. It was really beyond belief, right? There are things there called finals clubs that are the Harvard equivalent of frats. There was one for highest income students, for which at that time you were supposedly, right, you were supposed to bring back before they had back when plane tickets were actually printed out, you were supposed to bring a first class ticket to Paris and rip it up as part of your initiation, right? So there were plenty of folks like that, right?
Good Lord.
Yeah.
Good Lord.
Quite a lot. So, I knew those people too, but I was lucky, I think, in that I had a group of people who were like me, who were interested in lots of different things, who were interested in music performance, excellent music performance there. I think that there were maybe 3 folks from when I was there who are in the LA Phil now. Plenty of amazing violists who were playing all over the world. So the performance was really, really at a high level, and I was very lucky for that.
Wow. So, okay, Harvard, you did a bunch of other things. I want to talk a little bit. There's so much to talk about in your life. I was trying to formulate these questions, And I was like, I don't even know what order to put these in. So I was started with the Viola Performance, and you're playing with Sphinx in the 2005 competition, the third place winning. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Sphinx. We've had Sphinx on our podcast multiple times. We've been lucky enough to get to know a lot of the people who work there and some of those musicians. But if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about that competition, and also then how Sphinx as an organization has served you as a player throughout your life.
Yeah, the most important part for me has to do with the networking that I got from it and the connection to a much larger community. I never really thought about it until I was much older, but I spent so much of my time performing with other Black musicians of color, when I was in my 20s and my early 30s, mostly because of those networks. I mean, even today, where I was just teaching up at Apple Hill in New Hampshire, there were folks I met who I had known from Sphinx orchestras programs years ago, right? And, I'm sure that people listening to this podcast know how this works, but this is how we get hired, through our networks, right? So I had a lot of opportunities. I played in a lot of chamber groups. I got to know a lot of rep that I probably would not have known as intimately as I do if I hadn't had those experiences. That was probably the most important part.
So just to back up a second, 2 questions here. You mentioned you started on the violin. So how did the viola come into the picture?
Yeah, so
Didn't have enough at school, and they were like, we really need you to play viola.
Of course. And also, I have long arms, and I don't feel an extreme need to be a soloist. I actually like playing intervoice harmonies inside of string quartets and sextets and stuff like that. So it made sense for me just to do that. And also I kind of got a kick out of learning alto clef. The rep I like a lot better, honestly, because we do not have as much, say, hardcore classical era rep. We have a lot of 20th century, 21st century rep that is usually of a different flavor, sometimes a lot darker, certainly has a different aesthetic, which is something I'll talk about later. But yeah, and the sound, the fact that you get to make that viola sound, which is unlike anything else. And that's the main thing that we do. We don't play fast and loud. We just make that sound, and that's what I like.
Definitely. So how old were you when you started the viola?
I would have been, I think, 12 when I first had a viola in my hands and started playing it, and then I was playing it in orchestra, and I was enjoying that, Then I got into high school. I was playing that in my high school orchestra. I was playing that in various places. I was still taking lessons on the violin, and then I was doing both for a while. But then I think it was at the end of high school when I really switched and stopped playing violin. There are folks who really play both professionally, and I find that so impressive because it's hard to do that convincingly and professionally. But that's not my thing.
Got it. So when you started at Harvard, did you think you were going to be a viola performer from the get-go? Because the reason I ask, I went to Brown in my first year. I thought I was going to be an engineer or some type of lab scientist. And then I got to conduct for the school's Gilbert and Sullivan group, and the rest was history. So did you have a similar moment like that? Or were you, I really want to go to Harvard because I love Harvard, but I want to do music performance as my career?
Yeah, so I got there and I was like, I'm going to do something else. I'm not going to do this. I'm going to try all the things that they have and see what I want to do. And then after my first semester, I was like, yep, I'm going to play music here. So, and I was very lucky. I mean, I had a pretty stable string quartet with mostly the same membership for my whole time there. We did some competitions. We were very serious. I spent most of my time rehearsing and performing. And I was also a double major, psychology and music. And I ended up not finishing that because I just couldn't get myself together to write a thesis in my senior year, unfortunately. So I only got the AB in music theory. I'm a music theorist, technically. Oof, that sounds weird. I'm not a music theorist. Yeah, but that's pretty much how that came to happen. And then, by the time I was graduating college, I was so deeply immersed in that life that it was clear I was going to go and get a master's and all those things.
Definitely. I've heard at Harvard, if you double major, your thesis has to combine both of your majors.
Yes,
so that I
exactly.
can imagine is always a tall order.
Yeah, it was totally possible. I actually had trouble finding a good mentor who was into the same things that I was into, so it didn't work out. But, it's okay. I took all the coursework. I learned some good stuff. I had a good time.
Definitely.
I feel like you've written your thesis now, though.
Yes, I have.
You for sure have written your
have.
thesis. So you're at Oberlin now. You have been at all these amazing institutions, and we've mentioned the book. And I want to talk about your book that you wrote, because so much of what's in the book is applicable to so many other topics of conversation. So in Assimilation versus Integration in Music Education, you really articulate issues facing minority students at conservatories and schools of music. So as someone who has gone through as much education as you have and now works in education, what are some things that you hope to see either change or be brought to light in higher education that will lead to more DEI work happening that you really articulate in this book?
Yeah. So I'm going to go back and backtrack a bit and talk more about the racial politics that I think are informing a lot of the initiatives, diversity initiatives that are happening right now that frankly do inform the popularity of organizations like Sphinx among white leaders in orchestras, other programs. So the issue that I try to take on in the book is demographic inclusion. And that means who's on stage, who's in the classroom, who is physically included, right, in what we do. And frankly, also the politics of representation, because I really want to problematize the way that we're approaching the diversification of classical music, right? It's not sufficient simply to say we're going to have black and brown people on stage, and that means that we've been inclusive. It does not mean that. For a large number of reasons. But first of all, it's really important to recognize that it's 2024, we're past the idea that we, being people of color, should have to demonstrate that we can play Mozart or Brahms, right? Yeah, it sounds silly. Yes, yeah. For earlier generations, that was entirely, or a large part of the point, really important. No, we can do this. We deserve to be here. Of course we deserve to be here. Right? That's not a question anymore. And for the younger generation, like the students that I teach, it's even less of a question. Like, of course we belong here. What are you talking about? Right? We know that. So the question more is, what is a 21st century classical music industry going to look like? How are we actually going to do this in a way that's inclusive? In other words, the field itself has to change if it wants to be more attractive to populations of color in the United States. And so in the conservatory context, that's really coming from a number of places, but the curriculum is one of the most important ones, right? Sorry. It's not enough just to say that we'll have some diversity initiatives that increase our retention of and recruitment of black students. When they get there, often they find that the way that the curriculum is designed elevates a particular kind of art making above the traditions from which or with which they may feel themselves more culturally associated, right? So at Oberlin, for example, we've had a lot of success with with curricular diversification. We have a djembe orchestra that's 2 semesters. We have a jazz voice major that is concomitant with all kinds of different gospel choirs. Our theory faculty changed up our theory curriculum.
I was going to say a lot of theory is Western classical music theory, not actual music theory of the world.
Not actual music theory. Yeah, right. So the message that sends when we spend an entire semester just doing four-part counterpoint and voice leading is that this is the best music. Right. Other musics are not as significant, and certainly, students who are coming from other traditions, they feel that deeply, right? And it's very difficult for them. But even beyond that, right, there's the question of creativity and replication, which is mostly what we learn in conservatories, how to replicate rather than how to be a creative artist. And I think that itself is actually often difficult for students who are coming from traditions where music making has been more creative, more spontaneous, more improvisational. When you look at those who are actually having success selling their art, right, which is what we're trying to do, right? More and more those folks, especially Black folks, are taking a much more creative, improvisatory approach. Getting into orchestras is extremely difficult, if not impossible. And newsflash, many people in orchestras are miserable, in large part because no one has trained them how to think about building a career as opposed to just getting a job, right. But also their creativity is stifled. And no one has ever really taught them what it could mean for them to be a creative artist. Right. And they may not get paid a lot, too. So lots of reasons why people are miserable. Not to bash orchestras, but although I do bash orchestras sometimes.
It's okay. You're allowed.
So again, simply saying we're going to have an orchestral fellowship and have a Black person in the back of one of the string sections every 2 years, we'll have a different one. That is not actual inclusion, right?
Right. Yeah. I think it's so much of, I'm so excited to talk about this more, but it's such a difficult topic, and I'm really glad that you talk about it very candidly. And there's many people in the field who do. But this idea of the tokenizing of DEI work and how this is a very cyclical conversation. I mean, season 1, we talked with Eric was talking about how, he was on a panel in the 1980s about how to diversify classical music. And then he was on a panel in the early 2000s about how to diversify classical music. He's like, okay, if this is going to be something that's a long stay, we got to get rid of the tokenizing, which that was back in season 1, which was, 4 years ago now that we were talking about this. So it's really nice what's the intentional deep work about actually creating spaces. So, yeah.
That's funny because that was my exact experience. I was on a panel. Actually, a lot of the ideas that I sort of developed in the book came to me after a conversation with some fellow panelists. I was going to go out to our conference and give a panel presentation about diversifying classical music. And we had a phone call, the 3 panelists, and, the first, all really smart people, really, really good people. And we also did the same thing, we're trying, here's what we're trying to do. It's getting better. We had a nice conversation, and then I hung up and I thought, this is nonsense. I've been saying the same thing for 15 years. Right. And what does it actually mean? What is actually changing? Besides the fact that there are a few more people of color on stage than there used to be. And that's when I came to the idea of aesthetics. I had been working with the American Society for Aesthetics. I had a grant to publish a annotated bibliography on the aesthetics of African American Western classical music. And so I thought, when students come to me and they say, I don't feel comfortable in this environment, I don't want to be in the conservatory, I don't like coming to the conservatory, what is it they're talking about? And I was, reflecting upon the fact that it's not just the fact that the music is by mostly male, mostly white composers, although that is important. But it's how people behave. It's how we interact. It's how we're taught to move our bodies in social situations, in public and private, on stage, how we're taught to speak about music, how we're expected to speak from the stage, what we wear, that all these things are culturally delimited. And of course, race being not real, a construct, still, culture often aligns with race because of our history of segregation, right? So I actually went to this conference, and, the first guy stood up and said, here's what we're trying, it's getting better. The second guy did the same thing. And I said, I'm so sorry to do this to my panelists, but I had to say, I think this is kind of nonsense, and here's why. And I got a standing ovation, and, some people were shocked, some people were happy. There was one story that came out of that because, we were having a candid conversation. And one person who was an orchestral manager revealed that when they have hip hop at the symphony night at his orchestras, that's the night that they hire security and put in metal detectors, right? So what message did that send to that audience? 1, 2, it's clear that the intention is to say, here's something fun and cool, And then maybe the smart ones will come back for the real music. I mean, let's be honest, right? That's what people are thinking.
Yeah.
So as opposed to trying to find a way to actually incorporate hip hop as an art form into what one does regularly and to create something new.
So you just gave us a lot to chew on here.
We're going to get so much to chew on.
But let me just ask a follow-up question here. So first, Rachel and I both went to the League of American Orchestras conference in Houston last month, and I attended a session on diversifying our stages, and I found it to be incredibly unhelpful personally. I apologize to anybody who is on the panel who will listen to this, if anybody. But hearing what you just said begs the question, is it even worth it for, should we even try to, is there a point in us trying to diversify our stages?
Well, let's be honest about who is benefiting. Certainly people of color are benefiting by demographic inclusion because it's great to get to play. It's great to have a job. But the folks who are also benefiting, and perhaps benefiting in some cases more. So, of course, the orchestra is a product that orchestral managers are tasked with selling, right? And that's a very difficult job. So to say that one's product is more diverse, is going to appeal to a more diverse audience base, that benefits the orchestra management the most, and the players, if more people are coming to their concerts. It's benefiting the white audience because they can feel less guilty about the fact that they're taking part in this art form that historically has been so exclusive and racist, right? And they can say to themselves, look, this is not so exclusive and racist. There are black people up there. But the larger framework is left untouched. The fact that the Masterwork series consists still, of course, of mostly male European conductors remains untouched. The fact that we're wearing tuxedos on stage, for what godforsaken reason, I cannot imagine. There's no other context as an American in which I wear a tuxedo except for performances. What does it mean that we do that, right? I was talking to a colleague the other day in a major orchestra who related a story from a black colleague of hers whose hair had apparently been too unwieldy one day, and the conductor said, you need to make that less black.
No.
Yes. So those kinds of things happen all the time.
I'm not talking about the color of the hair.
No.
My God.
No. So what was the conductor talking about, though? He's talking about the aesthetic presentation of the hair. In some way, it's perceived to be unruly. Now, if you think about also how orchestras function, tidiness is really important. Order and rules and law and all this stuff, which is also how the music functions, right? There's an aesthetic to the music that also is in relation with all those other kinds of aesthetics of self-presentation. And those themselves do not align largely with a lot of the values and aesthetics that people of color are accustomed to. It took me a long time to realize this as someone who is educated, who has so much education, one. Two, so much music education. Because what about classical music could possibly be alien to me? And yet I consistently found things that were, right? And then, of course, the question for me as a middle-class black person is like, well, is that a racial issue? And if so, is my blackness, quote unquote, having to do with it? But what is my blackness if I've been raised in these mostly white spaces, which is the case for a large percentage of the kinds of folks who actually get into orchestras who are black and brown people.
There's so much to think about here, and I often think I grew up in bluegrass music, which is the improvisational. It took me a minute to adjust to youth symphony when I joined as a young bassoonist. I was like, okay, I got this. We can do it. But you're right. I knew pretty immediately when I started playing music that I love creativity and I love creation, and I didn't see that for individual players within an orchestra. And so the aesthetic of some place where if you are getting into an art form to express yourself and be creative and have this voice, that is really difficult. We had a really good conversation with Amanda Powell about this idea about musician satisfaction in orchestras, and what can you do to increase that satisfaction. And that's a whole like finding joy in the music that you're making. But if you add a layer on to that, where you're now in a space that not only are you not feeling free to be creative, but you're also not free, and the second racial or cultural layer of this just feels very alien to what you are used to, that's something I can't imagine, right? I've never been in spaces. I've been in spaces where I was the only white person in the room, but that happens very infrequently, and I don't feel unsafe. Like, I'm not in a space where I feel like I'm being threatened. But yeah, it's a really difficult line to walk, because at the Can Symphony here, we've made a charge of like all of our Masterworks concerts have to have a composer of color or a female composer, which is great. And that we do that. We're holding ourselves accountable, but also that's just
symphony concerts
youth symphony concerts as well. But that's just, that's one layer. Our orchestra body is not very diverse. We do participate in the Sphinx auditions, but many of them, when, with the Sphinx auditions, we add them to our sub list. Many times they're not able to make it to the concert. So then we're not there. And so that's an issue that I'm like, there's all these musicians, or they're already on our roster because they're CIM students. Yeah. So it's, I don't know. There's just so many of these issues that feel so much bigger and feel like it has to be a change that we as American orchestras all kind of decide together to work on, so that the spaces that musicians are auditioning in and going into and all these different places start to feel different than they have in the past. And I don't have the answer for what that looks like or what it is.
It was abundantly obvious to me at the conference that nobody in the profession has figured this out.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I would just introduce the possibility that there's something about inherently the structure of the orchestra, the way that it's made, that is very difficult to absorb into a more creative environment, right? So actually, one of my colleagues at this festival that I just came back from, the Apple Hill Chamber Music Festival, awesome pianist. We played Dvorak E-flat piano quartet. He killed it. He's an amazing pianist, but he actually improvises. That's a huge part of what he does. And he's equally skilled at that in various styles as he is in playing Dvorak. And he wears a hoodie, he has a baseball cap, he's like in streetwear all day. For the concert, actually, he had a nice tux jacket and a baseball cap and like some really cool boots, right? So he's aesthetically, he has some awareness that what he should be expected to do as a classical pianist is not what he wants to do and is not expressive of himself and his values. And I thought that was just so cool to see somebody doing that. Most of my former students too, who are Black, a lot of them want to create. They really want to create something. So they're making beats and they're writing music and they're playing along with that, and the idea of just sitting in orchestra is extremely unfulfilling for some of them. Not for everybody, obviously. Many people do want to do that, but a lot of people want to have the ability to feel creative as artists. And then, so what do you do with that? I mean, how is the orchestral experience going to be appealing writ large to a Black population if that population is accustomed to more creative freedom in the art that they consume, right?
This is actually really fascinating, because I'm thinking about my own experience, what makes me tick musically. I love the ensemble. Like I in addition to conducting here, I sing in my church's choir in the bass section as a volunteer. I love being in the ensemble, singing the music on the page and blending with the ensemble. And it's like the exact opposite of what you're talking about. But that makes me tick. So it's like, I guess we have it. There are many aspects of music that are very different from one another. And I'm like, I will also tell you, I'm not a composer. I'm not creative in that way. Like, I am an interpreter through and through. Yeah. So it's interesting to see this two sides of this.
So I would say the ensemble is different, right? Because large ensemble is a different experience. The way the orchestra functions is a different experience. So if you take, for example, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, AACM, that George Lewis was a big part of in the 60s and 70s and still around now, That idea of a chamber collective that's playing in different styles and that no one particularly is leading at any given time. Not hierarchical in that way, right? The orchestra is deeply hierarchical, deeply conservative. Actually, Bruno Nettle in Heartland Excursions, his book about conservatories in the Midwest, he writes about this. What would an anthropologist think about the orchestra if he just came upon it? And he says it's no accident that the orchestra evolved in tandem with industrialization. It resembles the military, the plantation system, the industrial factory, right? So, from that perspective, you don't speak. You're spoken to by only one person. Maybe the section leaders talk to each other a little bit, right? Everything is very much dictated to you. That's the opposite of what the AACM and those kinds of groups were about, right? And so there are lots of new Black chamber groups, new Latinx chamber groups that are springing up, I think in large part because that kind of ensemble playing, which involves spontaneity and creativity, people find appealing.
Yeah, no, it's just very interesting. It's what makes different people tick in music. It's just a very interesting thing to me. I want to move on a little bit to what you're doing now. So you are, in addition to your work, to your job at Oberlin, you are earning a DMA in Viola Performance at CIM and a Ph.D. in musicology from Case Western. First of all, how do you have the time to do all of this?
Well, I don't. That's definitely true. So many things that I'm doing, I usually do only one of them at a time, and then I take a break and go back to the other one. Right now, I'm going to push to finish my dissertation, which has just got to be done. So I'm focusing mostly on that.
This is your Case Western my musicology dissertation.
Yes, and the nice thing about my degree program is that it's one dissertation to rule them all. So I just do the one, and I get both degrees.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
okay.
Because I've finished everything else, my recitals, the coursework, it's all done. So I just have to finish this out. But yeah, it's hard. I mean, I have a family too, which is the most important thing that I'm doing. Yeah, really. And, of course, kids take a lot of time. That's probably the hardest part because I can't plan around the kind of emergencies that they're going to have. I'm very, very, very detail oriented with my time and very specific about organizing my day. And then, if something happens and someone gets a boo-boo and it has a tantrum, then my plans are out the window. So that happens.
Now, were you working at Oberlin while you were deeply immersed in your coursework, or did that come more when you got to the dissertation phase?
No, so I was, yeah. I've been there for 10 years, and I went to a part-time. They were able to let me do that when I started my degrees. And then, frankly, in some ways I was, I wouldn't say helped, but COVID, what happened during COVID probably facilitated my ability to finish because there was no question of whether I was going to work or going to class. I wasn't going anywhere, right? So I was just on Zoom finishing my classes. I think my final recital was just me and an organist because I played with organ in an empty recital hall, right? So yeah, that was certainly weird, but it made things a little easier. And my younger son was born during COVID, while I was finishing my last semester of classes. It was really, really, really hard. That was really hard, but I did it. Hard things happen.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. So you're finishing up your dissertation, which is focused on African American musical aesthetics. And in a line describing it, you say, the issue of diversity should be approached through the lens of aesthetics, and that the performance and pedagogy of Western classical music must change if a more diverse membership is to thrive in this genre.
Yeah.
Give us a little preview about your PhD dissertation here.
Well, so that's from my book, which came out last summer. The dissertation is, in fact, entirely separate. So I'm writing about Coleridge Taylor Perkinson, the composer.
Oh, wonderful. Really okay. Yeah. Very good.
Yeah. Fascinating guy. And also, he grew up in New York. I grew up in New York. He grew up not that far from where I grew up. It's funny when I started really looking into his life, finding all these similarities. And the story about him is not really well known. This really points to, again, the issue with demographic diversity, even in programming. There are plenty of biographies that are written for program notes about him that are incorrect, that don't have his birthplace correctly, or if you Google him, as of last month when I was doing this research, if you Google him, the first image that comes up is not him. It's the violinist Sanford Allen, for whom he wrote the piece Blues Forms. And so a number of websites use that picture. It's not even Coleridge Taylor Perkinson, right? And the sort of lack of attention to detail, again, suggests the performative nature and the superficial nature of a lot of the research that has been done since 2020, when everyone scrambled to program blackness into their concerts without truly a deep consideration of what they were doing, why they were doing it, why it was important, and really a need to get it right.
We had Sarah Davis Buchner, pianist, she was on our podcast, and she was asked to play Florence Price piece. I forget just piano concerto.
If it's for orchestra, it's probably the piano concerto in one movement.
And she had the copy from the publisher, and it was a mess. It was an absolute, and Sarah was like, I don't know, who allowed this to be published? She's like, I rewrote it and sent it because it was, there was no attention to detail of publishing Florence's work. And it was, granted, everyone was scrambling to try to publish work. And so it was, but that was a really interesting example that Sarah gave us.
And on the other side of that, when we had Rachel Barton Pine, she called out G. Schirmer for their editions of Florence Price for just trying to pump them out. And I will say, I've conducted a couple of them just because I really like Price's music and I wanted to do it. And they're good to read in the very least, but you find stuff here and there that you have to fix.
Yeah. I think that's just indicative of where we are in terms of repertoire diversification, that we're still in a very early stage of really doing that. And frankly, from my perspective, if you go back and research some of these black composers who were writing in the early mid 20th century, there is a certain degree of self-hatred that comes through in their own comments about black music, about jazz. The same kinds of racist ideas that white composers had, a lot of those black composers learned those ideas too. Not all of them, but many of them. And they talk about it openly, right? Even say Samuel Coleridge Taylor in his 24 Negro Melodies talks about how taking these savage tunes from the jungle and turning them into real music. You know what I mean? So perhaps the future is going also to incorporate new commissions and new pieces that use the orchestra in different and new ways. So, for example, I used to play in something called the Soulful Symphony in Baltimore, which was a full orchestra, a full jazz band, and a gospel choir on stage all at the same time. And we would regularly sell out Strathmore, the Baltimore Symphony's halls, right? We would sell them out. And we played hip-hop symphonies that were written by the conductor with MCs and DJs coming on stage with us for various movements, right? That was a really successful orchestral experience for the black audience of Baltimore, right? So that kind of activity, I think there's a lot of promise for more experimentation in that way. In addition to also incorporating more works by composers of color into the existing canon.
So we've talked a lot about we've mentioned musical aesthetics, and I know that you're doing your Ph.D. with musical aesthetics. Musical aesthetics appear in your book a lot. For people who've maybe never thought about that ever in their entire lives, I know you've mentioned it. I think we have some idea about it, but why is the idea of musical aesthetics so important to assimilation versus integration when it comes to the DEI and what we're doing?
Yep. So this is a complicated question, and I usually start by articulating non-musical aesthetics that are part of music. So, for example, in my book, the last chapter has to do with transcripts of interviews with graduates, and one of them says, I didn't have the words to talk the way that I was supposed to speak in theory class. I didn't have the words to express myself. And she said, at one point, I just gave up on trying to do that. And I would, just come in and say, you know what, that piece slaps. Yo, that piece is the bomb. Because that's how she felt comfortable expressing herself. But that was really not accepted. She wasn't supposed to do that. And she felt weird herself doing it, right? So the vocabulary that we're supposed to use in music criticism, in evaluating music, is very specific and racialized and cultural and all these things, right? The kinds of clothes that one can wear on stage, again, one could say, well, this is just what one wears to look good. That differs by culture. People have different ideas about what that should be, about how one's hair should be done, right? About what shoes one can wear to be quote unquote appropriate. And so those limitations, right? Students are learning this is the best way to be. This is how the best music is made. And it happens to not align with how you learned how to dress, with how you learned how to talk, with how you learned how to do your hair, right? So those aesthetics are sort of a bit easier to understand. Think about even how you walk on stage. Like actually in the Sphinx competition, my first year there, I was watching the junior division, and I remember there was this violinist playing Mozart, right? There were 3 violinists all playing Mozart concerto, the G maybe, or the A, I can't recall. But it was one with an orchestral introduction. I remember he sort of waited for the orchestra to start before he walked on stage, and he kind of strutted on stage, did his thing, bopped around a little bit. Then the last possible second flipped up his violin and started playing, right? And then I think he improvised his cadenza or something crazy like that, right? So his Mozart also was a little bit out of tune. And so out of 3, he got 3rd place, but he got the Audience Choice Award for a black audience in Detroit at that competition, right? Because that was what they judged as quality, what they wanted to see. The way in which he was performing, right? And the fact that the intonation was not perfection was less of a musical consideration, like less of an actual musical consideration, right? We don't care if this is perfectly in tune. We care that you're emoting something and showing up and making a performance that has meaning for us, right? Aside from just the notes, which have less meaning. So it's easy to say, well, but their taste is bad. They haven't been educated properly. No, their taste is different. That's all. It's just different. And getting to that point where you can not look down on how other cultures deal with issues of quality is a really hard thing for musicians to do, because we are taught aesthetically to identify with a certain system, right? It must be in tune. And if it's not in tune, it's not just bad music. You're a bad person if you play out of tune. I mean, people feel this way. We feel this way, right? As opposed to maybe there's a different goal that you should have with your manipulation of your instrument other than just playing in tune. Maybe you have to play something that means something, rhythmically or in some other way, or make a sound. So like in black musical aesthetics, imitation of natural sounds, animals, birds, other things that exist in nature, that is an aesthetic goal. Ollie Wilson, who is the founder of our Tomorrow department at Oberlin, has a number of articles where he articulates black musical aesthetics. This is one of them, right? That idea that making a sound that sounds like a bird cawing, right, is an ideal. It's a totally different approach to music making, right? And certainly it could be difficult to think about how to integrate those two systems. And when I started writing about this, actually, some of the pushback I got when I was talking about integration of musical aesthetics, also what's called transculturation, which I think is the potential future. I had folks who would say to me, why should we integrate? We already do what we do. Why would we integrate with European aesthetics? Why should we even care about them, right? Which is a question to which I don't have the easiest or best answer. I think the answer is really more from the perspective of the classical music industry. If we, that is the gatekeepers of this industry, want this to be more diverse, then we do need to begin to integrate aesthetically and do things differently in order to appeal to a more diverse audience base.
I think the story about the Mozart performer at the Sphinx raises a lot of interesting points. To me, if I wanted to hear somebody play a note perfect perfectly in tune rendition of something, I would listen to a robot playing it. But I want to hear a human soul put themselves into it. A concerto, especially. They're the soloists. They should put their human self into it. And so I completely understand why the audience would pick that particular performer. Also, it's very much in the tradition in Mozart's time to improvise the cadenza.
Right. Yeah.
So go for it. I mean, I did the Mozart 20th Piano Concerto with one of my dearest friends as a sort of a joint graduation recital. I went to Manus, by the way, for my master's. I assume you were at 85th Street, the beloved old building at 85th Street, which sadly they're not at anymore.
I know. Oh.
But anyway, so I did my master's degree recital with my friend, and I told him I would like him to improvise a cadenza. He wasn't quite brave enough to do that, but he wrote his own and he learned it, which was still... he put himself into it in that way.
We've talked a lot about how the classical music culture does not breed comfortability with improv. And we've talked about that a lot. Especially this season on this podcast, we've talked about it a lot. And I first encountered the bassoon at a bluegrass festival, so like that's a whole story about how my ideas of things. But it's
I played jazz saxophone,
but it's
a lot.
It is hard to think about creating ownership within something, and when it is such a big scale thing. But I mean, our audiences right now at the Canton Symphony we have a growing audience right now, which is very exciting for us. I think a question that we're asking ourselves a lot right now is making sure of placing importance and intention on the things that aren't our traditional repertoire, in the quotes, of making sure that we're intentionally doing things, trying not to be, tokenizing with it, but finding really cool and innovative ways to make people feel more comfortable in the hall and to add something different into the quote unquote traditional repertoire, and just do it in a little bit different ways. Hopefully trying to, because, in our community here, it's a lot of blue collar workers, a lot of people who are just living there's a larger white population here, but we do have 20% Black population in Canton, but a lot of just working people that orchestra is not talking about black, white, talking about just orchestra wasn't marching band and football is their language, right? So what can we do to make that aesthetic feel better here?
I think like taking a larger view and being conscious about how many aspects of performance or of orchestral performance are alienating, right? So what you're supposed to wear, as you're saying, like working class folks, they may not own quote unquote concert attire, whatever that means. What that really means is they have some expectation that they need to do something different with themselves than what they would usually do to feel comfortable just to come here. With many, so like, I don't want to be essentialist, right? It's important to avoid that, saying like, oh, black people do music like this, white people do music like that. That's not the case, right? And again, these racial categories are not real. Cultural categories are real. But in black musical aesthetics, traditionally, the interaction between audience and performer is a major part of the performance, right? Call and response, the performer taking energy from the audience giving it to the performer so the performer can give it back, right? That's absence, for the most part, in how we perform classical music, right? I mean,
there's a fourth wall.
Yeah, the fourth wall, right, exactly.
Orchestral performance, certainly.
Exactly. To even make a sound in the audience is a sin, right? Like, you're not allowed to do that. Whereas actual vocal interaction with performer is a big part, again, of black musical aesthetics traditionally. So you're saying that, and also the fact that one is seated the entire time and is not supposed to move or stand or do anything else or even clap if you like something, right? All of that is very alienating to many audiences, many prospective audience members.
Even people who just like popular rock music, they're like, "What do you mean? I don't care." what
But rock music is black music. It's black music. That's why it's like that.
And we did a gospel joined symphony concert. It was the most diverse our audience has ever been that I've seen it. And it was a blast. It was so much fun. I think all of our musicians were having a blast on stage. The audience was having a blast. I was like, this is a good time. We are having fun.
Truly, by Rachel saying the most diverse audience, it was not 100% of audience of Black people.
No.
Right.
Our patrons who
patrons-
subscribe to the Masterwork series.
Yes.
Some of our biggest donors said it was one of the most fun nights they had ever had at the symphony.
One of our biggest donors came up to me. He was moving and grooving, and he was like, this is the most fun I've had in 10 years or something like that.
So all that really points to the fact that we don't interrogate the aesthetic choices we make.
Right.
So actually, there's an article that I teach in one of my courses about how aesthetics are essentially political, not essentially. Aesthetics are political statements. And they're insidious in a certain way because you become inculcated into a certain aesthetic system without even really being aware of it. You just do what people around you do. Right. And then if you get out of line, someone corrects you. So that points to the fact that, especially for American audiences, this is fundamentally a European art form. When I go to Germany, say, and the orchestras are performing everywhere all day, there's a certain resonance there that holds because that actually has been their tradition for hundreds of years. American audiences, it's a bit different. People don't really know what they want. They don't ask themselves. They ask themselves, what should I do to be a good member of society? I should sit here in a suit and be quiet while people play. But is that what I want to do? Is that how I engage best with music making? Right? Maybe not, as your example suggests.
There's so much to talk about. I don't want to ramble on too much. I don't want to ramble on too long looking at time, but I do want to talk about a couple of things. One, other music traditions, we're talking about like politics and, like aesthetics being political statements. You mentioned critical race theory in your book a lot and how music education and critical race theory have suffered, music education has suffered. Yeah. So thinking about lifting up other musical traditions, because a lot of the classroom, as we pointed out, music theory that is taught is just Western European music theory. It's not encompassing of all music theory ever. What are some things that we could be thinking about, especially since, we have a youth symphony here, we work in our schools. What are some ways that non-white musical experiences are being kept out of the learning experience that maybe we aren't noticing?
Well, I think you're pointing to some of them already, such as the gospel choir experience, right? Yeah. That's uncommon. That doesn't happen. Things like soulful symphony don't happen. And the question is why? In part because educationally we're focused on teaching our kids, our students, that is, what we think they will need to do to be successful professionally, and that is to have played X, Y, and Z Beethoven symphonies, Mozart symphonies, to know the rep, right? But what is the rep, and why is this the rep? I think teaching students first and foremost how to be more creative, how to actually make their own music is a really critical step in integrating the curriculum. And I would say it is important to be fully cognizant of the kind of casual racism and racist attitudes that many white people do hold. This is a very difficult thing often for people to accept. Even for me, when I came to Oberlin, it was something I didn't want to accept at first. When I continually encountered it and said, man, there's some people who are in either part of the school or part of the neighborhood who are racist, really racist, right? And that was a hard thing for me to accept. I have colleagues who are racist. What am I going to do about that? And actually, there's not much that I can do, right? Even being someone who's in administration. So being aware in these environments, you probably have some colleagues out there who truly think that black music is trash, that black culture is trash, who truly do, I had times when I had colleagues who used the N-word, white colleagues, right? And I thought, very rarely. And then I thought, if they're doing that around me, right, then what are they saying to each other? And most nice progressive white people don't want to grapple with that idea that there are folks hanging out with them who truly have racist ideas and who truly don't want to integrate what they're doing, change what they're doing. So I think being really aware of that opposition, that like covert opposition exists. And if you think you're seeing it, then you probably are, right?
Yeah, that's a really hard one, because it's, even for me, recognizing that I have internal biases that I have to be aware of and be okay and be okay thinking about and talking about and battling, because there is no such thing as a non-racist white person in my, just because of how white people are raised in this country. Something's gonna seep in to your brain at some point. You're gonna be told something and you're gonna believe it because you're little. It's gonna happen, and you have to be willing to talk about it and think about it in really intentional ways. And it's really difficult to do, especially when you grew up with parents who were very progressive and didn't share those ideas with you. So I went to college thinking I was this perfect little person. I am not. So it's really hard to recognize that we are going to work with people who are blatantly sometimes, and that's hard to grapple with for sure.
And even like not blatantly, but I mean, I think about my own personal a preference. I love the formality of classical music. I love wearing white tie and tails to conduct. It brings me joy. Like, it makes my heart skip a beat. I know when I tie that white bow tie, it's like, I'm going to perform tonight. Like, it gets me excited. And it's sometimes hard for me to remember, not everybody feels this way about putting on white tie and tails.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's great. That's awesome that you have an experience of that joy. And everyone should be entitled to have that experience, expressing themselves in the way that they find appropriate, without others also taking offense or thinking that it's or denigrating it in some way,
Right. So I really want to ask you about another cool thing you've done in your life that I actually have a personal connection to. You are the deputy director and viola instructor at the Barenboim-Said Foundation in the West Bank. I actually got to do a project with the Barenboim-Said Foundation when I was in college. I got to go over to Nazareth and conduct my own arrangements of excerpts from the Magic Flute with a youth orchestra of the Barenboim-Said Foundation back in January of 2012. Cool. And it was an amazing experience. You must know Nabil Aboud Ashkar, who I worked very closely with over this week and got to know very, very well. So tell us a little bit about your experience there.
Well, so here's what I would say. I guess I've problematized diversification of classical music in the U.S., and now I would speak about international music education. There are two issues, one peace building and the other having to do with equity and cultural traditions. So I think on the individual level, because people usually point to that program, in particular similar programs, as examples of bringing people together through music to solve conflict. So on the individual level, I think that is very much possible and useful and helpful, just to be exposed to other people, to have a creative experience with other people who's from whom you may be deeply alienated or even hateful. On the community level, I think also that's very possible and very important. And depending on what's going to happen in that area, perhaps these projects will have meaningful utility going forward, depending on how those two populations integrate or do not. Also, it's really important to have nuanced understandings of conflicts, and the fact that there's something called negative peace, right, which is peace with the absence of justice. And sometimes these kinds of programs can support the development of negative peace in a really unhelpful way. And that's not to say that they're necessarily bad, just that a lot of the time, the consideration that goes into these kinds of programs is not nuanced. It's very much insufficiently nuanced, and oversight is very much often very lacking, right? And the kind of work that actually needs to be done there cannot be done by a musical program. Sorry to say that, right? But it's true.
Yeah, I ask myself that a lot when it comes to, and like kind of get into our last couple questions here, what is our place as an orchestra? I mean, we're an orchestra. We are here to make music. I do say that music does save lives, but we're not doing, we're not the political workers in the country. We are making music. And so, your master's degree from Columbia is in human rights and conflict resolution. You have so many great degrees. I mean, it's just,
Too many.
You make me want to go back to school.
Sorry, yeah.
No, it's great. You make me want to go back to school. But in a time, thinking about, Palestine right now, but also in our own country, about how divided things can really seem, and how it's so difficult for people from quote unquote different sides to be able to have any sort of way to have conflict resolution and actually having conversations and consensus building. What is something that we can do as musical organizations to be a part of that consensus building for the future?
I think experimenting and bucking the trend is the best way to go. The kinds of things that you're talking about that this Canton Symphony is doing already to maintain an investment and a commitment to that, and to just do more of it. And of course, not everything will work, but being committed to finding ways to break the status quo, as opposed to just saying we're going to have more black and brown bodies on stage. Experimenting musically with repertoire, with different kinds of programming is the most important thing. Not just bringing some musicians to a school to play Mozart for black kids. Like, we're beyond that now. We're beyond that. So what's next? No one, as you were saying, really knows. But there are bright spots that we see through experimentation. I think that's the most important. And to recognize for majority white organizations, predominantly white organizations, that you may have to cede control over the decision making as to what happens here to BIPOC people, to black and brown populations. You may have to cede control. That's the hardest thing, I think, to consider also what one is going to stop doing, because it isn't just a matter of adding some new things. That's additive inclusion, right? We have to transform what you're doing, and then there are things you're going to not do anymore. That's the really hard part, because then people are letting go of cherished traditions. But guess what? Cultural evolution may call for that. I mean, are we going to be playing Beethoven in 1,000 years? Maybe. It's also very possible that we won't. And we have to be able to accept that. I mean, because one could say, well, but how could that be? That would be a horrible loss. Well, the only reason for that would be that we'd be playing something else that's more meaningful to those people in 1,000 years whose minds we cannot comprehend, right? Being willing to let go of all those things and interrogating why we're holding on to them so strongly.
I saw a really interesting, I was just thinking about, ancient traditions and reinventing yourselves and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. I saw an interesting video. I forget which museum it was, but there was a museum art curator who could talk about art, and the musical artist Post Malone going through a museum, and Post Malone, the way he talked, he was like, that one's dope. That one's cool. Like, it was just talking about this art, and the art collector was engaging in that and they were having really beautiful conversations about ancient pieces of art and why we still look at it. And it was really refreshing. I looked at that and I said, that's going to make a bunch of young people want to go to an art museum.
Right.
And so I just after like this whole conversation, Post Malone walking through an art museum, it's that kind of just being okay, looking at it and being like, cool or not cool, and having a way to talk about it in a way that you don't have to have the right words. You could just do it. I just thought that was
because it's very exclusionary, right? Yeah. You can only get those words through intense educational programs.
Yeah, and that's expensive.
It's very expensive. And then if you don't do that, then when you do engage with that art, perhaps you feel embarrassed because you don't have the right words and you know it, and you hear other people using those words, and then you feel less than and looked down upon. That's not very inclusive, right?
And, I don't know really much at all about visual art, and neither does my fiance, but when we went last year to the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and we could still talk about what we thought was cool about each piece. They had a silver, it was a drinking game. It was like a 500-year-old drinking game where you pour the wine in, and this thing comes up out of the middle, and then you like spin a wheel, and whoever it points to has to drink the whole thing. We're like, this is so cool. Like, it was our favorite thing that we saw the whole time.
Man.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So you know what? You find what you can relate to. And
Yeah. As it should be. Ideally, it should be that way and not exclusionary, where people are told that unless they behave in X, Y, and Z way, that they don't belong in that space.
Right.
Yeah.
So to wrap up, we will ask you the question we ask of every podcast guest at the end of the episode, and it's extremely open-ended, so take it however you will. How do we orchestrate change?
How do we orchestrate change? So let's see if I can do this without sounding pedantic or stupid. But seriously, though, in humanitarian work, the first thing that needs to be done is a needs assessment of the community. That is figuring out what does the community actually need. Like the trope when people are taught about humanitarian work is like, if you teach people how to fix bicycles, then you have a village of bicycle fixers. But who's riding the bicycle, right? I mean, can they actually employ themselves? What does the community actually need, as opposed to what you think they should have or what you are equipped to give them, right? Mm-hmm. Now, from the orchestral standpoint, one could say it's entirely possible in any given community that what the community needs is not an orchestra. That doesn't mean there aren't things that the orchestral an orchestral organization can do to engage the community. They may just be different things or new things that you haven't thought of before, right? And it's just like any business. These are businesses. Businesses reorient themselves all the time. They reinvent themselves. They start selling new products. They stop selling old products, right? Being really open to change and really honest about what the community needs, as opposed to just what are we equipped to sell to them. What do we have for them, right? What do they want? What do they need that we are in a unique position to give, right? In ways that we probably haven't thought of or looked at. So that kind of flexibility, I think, organizational, managerial flexibility is really necessary, as opposed to the idea that we sell Mozart symphonies and Beethoven symphonies, and our job is to make the community love it, by God, right? I mean, okay, we've been doing that for 40 years, and it's not working great. Let's be honest. It's not working great. It's working okay, not great. And perhaps that shouldn't really be the focus at all.
Chris, I'm really glad you came. I've loved speaking with you. I hope we get to keep having conversations. I'm very excited that books like yours are being written. So thank you so much for being here today and being a part of our little corner of the world in which we selfishly have conversations like this to give ourselves our own ideas about how to be a better organization.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Chris Jenkins, Associate Dean for Academic Support, Liaison to the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Visiting Professor of Musicology at Oberlin Conservatory.
Orchestrating Change is a production of the Canton Symphony Orchestra.
Our theme music was composed by Eric Gould and performed by Derek Snyder and Tim Adams.
Our audio engineer and mixer is Nathan Maslick, with video and audio editing by Shoreline Media.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.